This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we've got a special guest on the podcast today. His name is Nick FREITAS. So he is a YouTuber and social media influencer. So if you know this guy, you know him because he's normally talking at like a 45-degree angle away from the camera. And then at the end of his statement that he makes, he has a nice little cup of coffee. So for some of you guys, you know exactly what I'm talking about now. But also, he is a Republican member of the Virginia House of Delegates and a retired Green Beret. The thing about his YouTube channel, he has over 1 million subscribers, and he also hosts the Making the Argument podcast. This guy he's a firebrand, and he's very similar to me in that we find the subject that we're passionate about. We make sure that we're well-versed and well-researched on it, but then we give you our full-throated opinion as to what we think you should do and how we think you should think and how we think you should comport yourself moving forward. And so I didn't really do a whole lot of prep for this episode because I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to put some, random subject matters on my notes, and then we're just going to weave in and out. And so that's essentially what we did. So I talked to him about the coffee mug thing, like where did that whole thing come from? I talked to him about why he joined the military, why he ended up going into the Army, why he ended up going to Special Forces, Green Berets. And then also I talked to him about, okay, let's say you're 18 years old in 2025. What would you do in terms of joining the military in its current state with kind of the DEI and the wokeness inside? And he had a very, very interesting answer to that. But then we started talking about a lot of different subjects. I'm not going to be able to remember them all, but we were talking about the southern border. We were talking about the different terrorist threats that we're seeing inside of our own country and how we're able to be prepared for a lot of those things. And so we talked about, the mandate that was coming from the American public that said, look, we're tired of this administration. We're tired of the way that things are going. So we're giving the Republicans and Donald Trump at the helm a mandate here. And so we talked a lot about kind of those first 100 days. What can Trump get done immediately? But then maybe in that first year, what can he get done? And then really at the 2-year mark, because that's the only time you're guaranteed to have the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so what can you do in that period of time that sets us up for the future in a very positive and healthy way? But then we transitioned later on, this is about an hour and a half long interview or so, but maybe about an hour in or so, we transitioned into talking about masculinity and manhood, and specifically inside the church and Christianity. And that's where, I enjoyed the first hour, but I really loved the last 30 minutes because we're getting into the stuff that's kind of my neck of the woods, my bread and butter. We talked about how a lot of Christians they're really tender, but they don't really have the tough part. And where do they get those ideas, and how is that being modeled, and how a lot of Christian men don't really focus on being dangerous and how that's a really bad idea. And at the end, we wrapped up by talking about what it means to be a father, 2 sons, and a father, 2 daughters, and what do you model for them, and how do we do rites of passage? Guys, I really, really enjoyed this. So this is a great way to kick off some of the interviews here getting into 2025. So guys, without further ado, let's get into it. Nick FREITAS, welcome to Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast.
No, thanks very much for having me, man. Excited to be here.
I am pumped. We both have some in-ears, some new in-ears going on right now. So if you guys on YouTube see us messing with our ears, that's what's going on. But I guess, there's a lot of things that you and I talked about off air, and, we can connect, and there's a lot of serious topics, but there's one topic that I want to start with, which is probably more serious than anything that we're going to discuss today. And it's this question: how many coffee mugs do you own? Like, is it like a few? Is it like,
No, it's pretty, it's a pretty expansive collection, and it keeps expanding because now that's the favorite thing for people to send me. And no, someone just sent me a mug actually from California. It says, "Think while it's still legal." And
good plan.
Yeah. Every once in a while, though, people will send me one. I'm like, yeah, I kind of got a family-friendly show, and while I appreciate the humor,
yeah. Hey, I totally get it. I'm rocking this one by Fieldcraft Survival, so shout out to Mike Glover, SF community and whatnot. So we're gonna get into the real thing today, but I guess on the coffee mug thing, where did that start? Because if I'm like, hey, I'm talking to Nick FREITAS today, they're like, wait, who is that? And then I'm like, oh, it's the guy that stands at a 45-degree angle and says really pithy things and then drink it. They're like, oh yeah, I totally know that guy's like, yeah. Where did that come from?
So it's fun. I get the same thing at airports. Someone will come up and be like, are you the coffee mug guy? Yeah, it's a coffee mug guy. Totally by accident. That's how it started. Okay. I was out on my porch one day, and something showed up in my feed or the news or whatnot. I can't even remember what it was, but I was kind of being my typical smart alecky self. And so I made some little comment and then took a sip of my coffee, almost kind of like that Kermit the Frog meme or whatever. Yeah. And so I did it like 1 or 2 times. It's just kind of cause I was out on the front porch drinking coffee, right? It just happened to coincide. And then I did the same thing on something else. And in the comments, it started loading up like, dude, where's the coffee mug? Man, where's the coffee mug? Hey, it just doesn't hit the same without the coffee mug. And so I was like, okay, I'll play along. This give the people what they want. Right. And, then flash forward like 2 years, and now I've got like 60 coffee mugs, and people send me coffee mugs, and I've got coffee mugs for different occasions. And then it was, hey, and in fact, Sean Ryan was like, dude, are you selling coffee mugs yet? I was like, no. He goes,
oh my gosh,
what are you thinking?
Right.
I was like, all right, good point. So now we sell coffee mugs, which means we come up with more coffee mug ideas. And so it's become a thing. And it's funny. Every once in a while, somebody will be like, what's with the coffee mug? I'm like, are you new here? Like, this is a 4-year thing now, dude, or a 3-year thing. So that's how it started.
It's kind of like when people tune into my show and they're like, what's with all the anger? And I'm like, do you see my face? Like, look at this. Like, how could I just be normal? I have a red beard. I'm a ginger. Like, I'm a walking recessive gene. That's why. But hey, we're going to cover a lot of topics today. A lot of stuff that's kind of going on, even news cycle stuff to what's happening right now. But anytime I have someone on my show that raised their right hand at some point and said they were going to protect this country from enemies, foreign and domestic, I always like to know why, because I grew up in Lawton, Fort Sill, and so I was around a lot of that, but I went a different track, got a scholarship to go to school, and so I didn't end up going the military route. But for you, why the military, why the Army, and why eventually SF?
So the military was something that, my grandfather had served in the Navy in World War II, had like ran away from home at 16 to join or threatened to run away from home. And so his father signed the paperwork. My dad had been law enforcement, and I had always been really interested in military history. I got really, I remember when I saw the Ken Burns Civil War documentary when I was like, 11 or 12, and I thought it was fascinating. And so I wanted to serve in the military. Specifically, I wanted to go to West Point. Me and a buddy of mine, Pat Kaloran, we were both going to go to West Point together. And he is just incredibly intelligent, great guy, very diligent student. And I have other talents. So I always tease people that my military career started by West Point telling me like, your math scores suck, dude. This ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but I always wanted to serve, right? There was kind of a long tradition of service in my family. Some in the military, some in law enforcement. And then my mother, has been a nurse for over 40 years and done she's done missionary work overseas as well. And so it was this idea that, service is something that you do. It's not the only thing that you can do to serve your country or to, kind of test yourself as a man, but it's a pretty good way. And so, I decided I wanted to be infantry and I wanted to be airborne and I wanted to go to the 82nd Airborne. That was my first goal, is kind of like, what an iconic unit with a really, really interesting history from both World War I and World War II. And then since then, obviously, but I got in, it was a peacetime army. And I was like, oh, I think I'm done. Right? I think I'm done. All due respect to painting rocks and stuff like that. I don't want to do this anymore. And, the only thing going on was there was, the stuff going on in Kosovo. And I remember re-enlisting. I was going to re-enlist to go 1 battalion over. So I was in 2nd of the 325 Airborne Infantry Regiment as part of the 82nd. I was going to re-enlist to go across the street to 1st Battalion 325 because they were set for a rotation to Kosovo. And I remember my sergeant major getting furious with me and basically saying, I don't care what you do. I don't care. You re-enlist. You don't re-enlist. You do whatever. You are not going across the street when this battalion has sent you to EMT, air assault, sniper, ranger. Like, you can either stay here or you can go somewhere else, but you're not going across the street. And I remember being kind of furious about that. I was like, fine, I'll get out. I'm going to go be LAPD with my dad. Right. And then my wife was like, baby, we really haven't had a game plan to get out of the military. It's not like we're living in the lap of luxury here. How about we re-enlist one more time? We can go someplace that would be cool. We can save up money and then, you can go out and be a cop or whatever. And so I said, all right, baby, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to your first re-enlistment? And this was in, around 2000. First re-enlistment, you got a lot of options of where you're going to go. I said, do you want to go to Hawaii or Italy? She goes, oh, I want to go to Hawaii. So I re-enlisted to go to Hawaii. About 4 months after we got there, 9/11 happened. And I remember looking at my wife going, well, babe, I know what I'm doing for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And so, I saw all the guys, I saw all the SF guys, specifically a lot of 5th group guys and some 10th group guys over in Afghanistan in the early days. I was like, man, I want to do what those guys are doing. And so I went through the Special Forces qualification course and went over to SF and did a couple of combat tours over there with those guys. And I loved being in SF, loved being in the SF community. Yeah, it was great. It was great.
So you've also talked about that a lot on your show and everything like that. I'm curious for you though, because I've talked to a lot of other top guys, a lot of other special operations guys, and these guys almost to a man have said the same thing. So I'm curious what your take is. But if you were 18 years old in 2025, in this year that we're in right now, would you have that same desire to go and fight for this military? Now, well, actually, let me buy that back just a little bit. Let's rewind 6 months. We don't know that Donald Trump is going to win the election. Joe Biden is still technically running for office, even though he can't technically spell.
Yeah.
But at that point, you're 18 years old.
Yeah.
And are you still wanting to go into the military and potentially be sent to fight and die by that administration? So
it's interesting because we were asking ourselves this question, but it wasn't for me. It was for my son.
Okay.
And my son enlisted, signed the paperwork before the election, and he had an 11 Bravo contract, so that's infantry. He had an airborne contract, and he had a Ranger contract. So, you know, when he completes infantry basic, he'll go right into airborne. When he completes airborne, he'll go right into what they call RASP, which is the Ranger Assessment Program. And then he'll go to the Ranger Regiment, and Ranger Regiment is part of the Special Operations community and obviously, you know, one of the premier units in the world, and a unit that usually gets picked pretty quickly to go to dangerous places to do bad things to dangerous people. But we talked about that. Now, I will say that I was personally thrilled by the election result for a variety of reasons, but I'm not going to lie, that was certainly one of them. Not because I don't think Donald Trump will utilize military force when appropriate, but because I think he is far less likely to get us involved in conflicts we don't need to be in. And when he does get us involved in conflicts, I think he empowers the people on the ground to do the job that they need to do, and doesn't have any of these, like, you know, conceptions of the responsibility of the American military or the American taxpayers is to, you know, I don't know, bomb people into democracy. So that was something we went through. But again, when he signed the paperwork, it was that wasn't a sure thing. And, you know, we talked about it, we prayed about it. And we're people of faith. So we believe that if God's calling, if God's, and our kids all have their own relationship with Christ. And if they've prayed about it and they believe they're being called into something, one of the things I've been very, very adamant about with all of our kids is like, look, you know, have goals, have dreams, have ambitions, have passions. You know, you got to be able to provide for yourself. You got to be able to provide for your families and things like that. But just understand something. You're never going to know true joy and peace unless you're diligently engaging in the path that God calls you to, not the one that, you know, is necessarily going to make you the most money or give you the most accolades or whatnot. You need to be pursuing that. So, and he felt very convicted that this is something he needed to do. Now I won't lie, when he was considering what to do and he made it clear he wanted to go infantry, because originally I thought he was going to go into something more technical, you know, because he likes the idea of, you know, welding and things like that. I said, look, don't do the 18 X-ray program, which is what we call the SF baby program, because that's a 6-year enlistment. I said, you can always volunteer for SF and they got to let you go. So if you want to do something, do Ranger Regiment. That's fine. You want to do something special ops, do Ranger Regiment. They're a great unit. But that's a 4-year enlistment. And then figure out if that's really what you want to do. Figure out if this was a time of service and testing, or if this is something that you're going to do as a career. But all that to say, I completely understand people and parents that say, I respect the military, I respect our veterans, I don't want my kid to serve under an administration where they're potentially going to get us involved in conflicts we don't need to be in. Completely understand that. By the same token, I still believe, and I know this is, maybe it's a little bit naive, I still believe that the country and service in the military is far bigger than temporary occupants of political office. And I always want to be protected by a military that recognizes that their first obligation is the Constitution, and are willing to, again, go into dangerous places to do dangerous things on behalf of our country. So I hope we will always have people that are willing to that see the value and the merit in doing that. But never in my life have I had to worry about it as much as I do now. I will say that. I think that we have a political class that has become increasingly divorced from their responsibility to our service members. It's not just a rah the troops. The best thing that you can do for our service members is not just make sure that they're properly trained, properly equipped, properly taken care of, but also only properly deployed. And the first thing I will say to members of Congress is, if you are not willing to cast a vote to go to war, then you don't send anybody. How about that?
That'd be a great place to start.
If you're willing to put your name on the decision, that's one thing, but that's the starting thing, right? Because right now, the last several decades long conflicts we've been in, you show me where the declaration of war was, right? There wasn't. Congress was for it when, it made sense to be, and then abandoned it when it didn't, but didn't do any of the necessary things that would have required to actually pull people out in the right way. And then what did we end up getting? We get a withdrawal in Afghanistan, which is a complete betrayal of everyone that we sent over there to fight in that conflict. And it's a complete betrayal of the allies that actually served along with us. And so, so that's kind of a long, rambling explanation, but it really boils down to this. God help us if our military is ever staffed by the same quality of people that Congress is. I want it to always be staffed by honorable people that, regardless of what situations they're put in, conduct themselves with honor and nobility, because I do believe that military service is inherently honorable. And regardless of the conflict that you find yourself in, you can always do the job. You can always do an honorable job. I have I did 2 tours in Iraq. I look back now and I'm like, should we have even been there? But I never questioned the service that me and my friends, that my fellow, Green Berets did on that ODA over there. I don't question that. There was some bad people over there that we helped stop. And I sleep like a baby. But I do want a higher caliber of people representing us in Congress that understand the nature of what that sacrifice means and the long-term implications of what it means, not only for national security policy and potentially destabilizing regions that we really don't want destabilized, but also what it means for the destabilization of the American family when you're sending some of our best and brightest to go over and get killed. And now all of a sudden kids are getting raised without that father figure. Wives who never signed up to be widows are now widows as a result of that. And vice versa. You have, incredibly brave and courageous women that also lost their lives over there. And now their kids, their husbands, are without that. So I think we need a little bit better understanding of what the actual cost is, when it comes to overseas conflicts.
Well, certainly the actual cost. I think about that with the conflict in Ukraine, because there's a lot of think pieces and a lot of ink that's been spilled, thinking through that conflict. But I think about the sheer number of 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old, 30-year-old Ukrainian dudes that don't exist anymore, and what that's going to do to that country long-term, regardless of if Russia gets to keep a piece. You know what I mean? But I guess going back to a comment that you made, because you kind of pre-bought back your own comment where you said you might be a little naive, but you still kind of have this romantic idea about the military and about the country, and when we do send the military out to do things. But I never joined the military, but my understanding is the military is there to kill people and break stuff. Mm-hmm. And it seems like now the focus is more on, can we get someone who's queer with 2 mothers to join the ranks, because they need the army to do something for them, as opposed to them thinking to themselves, what am I doing for my country when I sign on the bottom line? So talk a little bit more about that specifically as it pertains to DEI. And yes, we know with, Pete Hegseth and with Donald Trump and with different, it could all be very, very different, but you still got some entrenched bureaucratic general types in both administrations, both of the last 2 administrations that have kind of sent us down this direction.
Well, I don't use the word. It's funny. My wife and I have had arguments before, because obviously I serve in politics. And so there'll be frustrating things that I talk about, and she'll be like, oh, that person's such a coward. And I'm like, baby, they're not a coward. They got a different way of looking at it. They got a different approach or whatnot. And the reason why I will do that sometimes is because I take the word coward very, very seriously. Someone calls me a coward, they better have done it online, right? Because person to person like that, those are quite literally fighting words to me. I can't think of there are very few things that would be worse than calling a man a coward, in my opinion. I caveat all of that to say that there's a lot of cowardice within the upper echelons of our military. And the sort of cowardice I'm referring to is the kind of moral cowardice that has been on display, where generals have bought into this idea that their job is nothing more than to faithfully execute whatever the orders are of civilian leadership. Now, I support civilian leadership of the military, but when civilian leadership orders you to do something as a general officer, to do something, to implement a policy, which you know, or at least you should know, is fundamentally detrimental to the warfighting capability and the esprit de corps of the United States military, your appropriate role, your duty at that point is to say, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary, I am not capable of implementing this policy because I think it would be incredibly detrimental to the warfighting capabilities of the country. And so therefore I must step down or resign from this position. How many of them have been willing to do that?
Not very many.
I mean, I don't know of many, right? Yeah. I can't name one off the top of my head right now. I will say this, General Mattis, who I respect. I don't agree with General Mattis about everything, but I respect General Mattis because when he got to a point when he didn't feel like he could faithfully execute Donald Trump's foreign policy, and I'm a fan of Donald Trump's foreign policy in almost every respect, he said, Mr. President, I'm no longer a good choice for Secretary of Defense for you. And then he left, and then he didn't immediately get a job on CNN trashing, the president or whatnot. He left. This was a respectful disagreement and with respect to policy, and he left. When did that happen with Joe Biden? You're telling me we didn't have one general officer with the intestinal fortitude, right, to tell a sitting president, Mr. President, I don't think West Point should be focusing on classes discussing white rage. I think we should be focusing on actually unifying the military around universal principles, which everyone can fight for, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of sex, regardless of, where they came from originally. These should be unifying components within our United States military and focusing on getting the job done in order to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Not one of them had the guts to do that. And so that's another thing where I look at, I remember when I got out of the military, I had a sergeant major friend of mine, really good guy. And he goes, Nick, this is crap. You're complaining about problems, but you're not staying, gaining rank and fixing them. And I said, well, you're a sergeant major. How many problems have you been able to fix? And I said, too many of our problems are not guys in uniform. They're guys in suits. But what I've learned is that in many cases, it's guys in suits and guys with stars. Because at some point, they caught on to the fact that there's a political game to be played. Now, I want to make something very clear. I'm actually being kind to the ones that think that there's a political game to be playing and they decided to play it. What's even more terrifying is the people that actually believe this crap.
Yeah.
Like if we actually have a senior officer corps that is absolutely convinced that critical theory is the appropriate way to explain disparity within society, well, then we've got a much bigger problem within the ranks of our military. And I think we need to be very, very careful about the influence of higher ed within our officer corps.
Sure.
Because there's a huge push to get officers to go get your master's degree, go be a Rhodes Scholar, go to Oxford, do this, do that. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I don't have any problem with higher education. I do have a problem with institutions of higher education essentially engaging in overt indoctrination in leftist ideology rooted in critical theory and postmodernism. You don't lead armies with guys like that. You lead really crappy HR departments.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where we're at. I don't know. We're going to see, because I think the Senate's going to fight tooth and nail. We're really going to see a crisis over the filibuster. I'm going to tell you that right now. That crisis has typically been on the left. We're going to see it on the right because there's going to be so much held up in the Senate with respect to presidential appointees. That I don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know what's going to happen with things like recess appointments. But I will tell you this, I am thrilled with the people that he has picked because they are going into these organizations with relevant experience, relevant life experience, sometimes relative legislative experience in the form of Tulsi Gabbard, relative operational experience, relative legal experience in the case of guys like RFK Jr. And he's sending people who are skeptical of the way things have been done into these departments. And that is what we need more than anything right now. I don't want somebody that rose through the ranks within these departments who's now going to be put in charge of it and not really do anything except try to expand budgets and authorities. I want people that are going to go in there and actually ask hard questions about what is this organization? What does this department exist for? What is our core mission? What are the things we're doing that facilitate that core mission? What are the things we're doing that do not facilitate that core mission and need to go away? And who are the people that are making it difficult to actually make the appropriate reforms? Because you're fired, right? That's what I want to see. And I hope to God we will. But to your point, I think we need, one of the biggest things that we're going to have to do is actually take a lot of senior leadership that refuse to say anything because they're just going to put their head down and play the game. You're gone. You're gone. Go be a CNN freaking military expert. You're gone now. We want people that have always recognized this was a problem. I mean, seriously, there used to be a joke that back in the good old days, you couldn't make Sergeant Major without an Article 15, right? It's time to start to look at maybe some of these field grade officers, these senior field grade, these colonels, lieutenant colonels that might have gotten sidelined by an administration that, they were really good war fighters, but they didn't like their politics. We need to start tagging some of those guys for senior leadership positions. And once again, reinventing the incentive structure within these organizations so that we're creating the sort of senior leadership that looks at their duties and responsibilities under the Constitution seriously instead of just looking for what they need to do in order to make the next rank.
Hey guys, real quick. I know a lot of you guys are really doing everything you can to have a consistent workout routine, but the problem is you work out at a Globo gym. And so there's 17 guys on the bench that you need, and there's people doing bicep curls on the squat rack. And the biggest problem is not your schedule. It's actually where you're trying to get your work in. How about you guys stop making excuses and build yourself a home gym? And when you do, make sure you use Sorinex. So Sorinex is a family-owned and operated business that builds some of the most impressive workout facilities in the entire world. They built gyms for teams in the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, and even the UFC. They've also built gyms for some of the biggest and most successful collegiate and high school athletic programs in the country. But in addition to that, they make the highest quality home gym products that I've ever seen on the market. In my personal home gym, I have the Sorinex Outfitter Rack, the heavy version in military green. Also, I have some of their center mass bells. I've got their Nordic glute ham developer and their patented landmine attached to my rack. So guys, stop fighting the riffraff at your local gym or bench or squat rack or whatever. And if you're going to build out a home gym, you may as well get one that will last you and one that you could even pass down to your kids. Begin your build out by going to Sorinex.com. That is Sorinex.com, Sorinex.com. Take control of where and when you work out, Sorinex.com. Well, right. And I think that when you're on this side, I think that's why we saw the mandate that we got from the generalized public of the United States when it came to the last general election, because the feel, Nick, going into 2017, first Trump administration versus going into 2025, second Trump administration, with a 4-year gap in the middle, everything feels different.
Yeah.
I don't remember being excited about his cabinet picks back in 2016 into 2017. And then, then it leaves the headlines and you just don't even know, you don't even realize these people aren't even in those jobs because it got held up in the Senate. But now Donald Trump, he kind of knows what the levers of power look like and kind of how you can move things around and how you can move chess pieces around on the board. And now we're seeing some people that, the RFKs, the Tulsi Gabbards, the Pete Hegseths, and, the list goes on to people that you're just like, holy Moses. It's not just because, I follow that person on Instagram. It's like that person is signaling that they're going to go in and clean house, but it's because of the mandate that the Republican Party, not necessarily the RNC, but that the Republican Party got from the generalized public, which was, we do not believe what the United States mainstream media is telling us anymore about who Donald Trump is. We do not believe what any of these other people are saying, but also we can see with our own eyes and hear with our own ears what's currently happening in front of us. And when you have an administration that seems to be more concerned about making sure that, supposedly trans inmates can be in with other women, or that the southern border can be wide open and anybody can willy-nilly walk their way through the country, it lets people know, it lets everyone in power know that this is what the priority of the American public is. And so I guess for you were just like I was and everybody else was. Nobody knew what the heck was going to happen in the general. People that pretended like they knew that was going to happen, they're out of their minds. But it was such an overwhelming victory for the White House and then both houses of Congress. Not that there aren't going to be issues. What are your thoughts about what that means in terms of what Donald Trump's going to try to get done, maybe even in the first 100 days?
It depends. That sounds like a very political answer.
Yeah, can you not give me the think tank answer, please? Like,
sure,
let's
there's a lot of people that think, Trump won, we're done.
Yeah.
No.
Not by a long shot.
Absolutely not even close. And there's a lot of people, and now I'm going to be critical of kind of like my own side on this. There's a lot of people that think, well, we put you in power. Why aren't you doing anything about it? Why didn't you get it done? You don't get to tell me that we need to be teaching, better civics in high school if you don't even understand how the American government works. The president is not dictator for 4 years. The president has to go through a process, right? We need, and it's not good enough to just have like majorities in Congress, right? Because you can have majority in the House, but if you don't have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, well, that's another hurdle that you have to overcome. And so understanding how this process works is really important so you can actually formulate the proper expectations and more specifically know where you can have an impact in that process. Because yes, we have given Trump the House, we have given Trump the Senate. It's not a filibuster-proof Senate, but we've given them the Senate. And then you have things like the cabinet level picks he's going to go through. Senate's got to advise and consent on that, which means they're not going to get put in there right away. The Democrats are going to try to hold that up as much as possible. Now, if you're sitting there going, well, we put Trump in power, it's been a year and nothing's changed. Yes, because this is a long process. It was meant to be. Our founders set up a long, difficult process in order to get things done because they didn't want to fast track legislation. Now, the question that I get back is, well, how come the Democrats always seem to? It's very easy. They're collectivists. We're individualists. So we're not individualists in the sense that like atomized individualism. We're individualists in the sense that we believe in individual liberty, small limited government, but we also believe in strong sense of community through family, through church, through other institutions. But what it also means is that we're very, very busy with our day-to-day lives. And so the way I put it sometimes is that a lot of people on the right, if you were to ask them their priorities, it would go like this: God, family, God, family, country, work, politics. And the only reason why they're involved in politics is keep the government out of God, family,
right.
and work, right?
Yep.
Now, if you talk to a woke progressive, they'll say, oh, I get it. Their priority is government. No. It's not that their priority is government. If you talk to a lot of woke progressives, government is God, family, work, country, right? It's this all encompassing, what you identify with and what you get your identity from and where you put your faith and your hope in. Most of that is completely outside of government and politics. And so politics is this thing that you recognize as important and that you engage in, but you don't spend nearly as much time as someone that believes it is the primary mechanism for bringing about utopia and justice in the world. Like if you honestly believe that government was the way that you solved all your problems and that you achieved cosmic justice, you would invest a lot more time in it. We don't believe that.
Right.
We don't invest that much time in it, right? So it's important to understand how the process works, the reason why the founders set it up the way it does, and the way it's been manipulated. So here's what I will tell everybody. The thing that President Trump can have, the two things that he can have the biggest impact on immediately, day one, is obviously border security. Because he has the Democrats claiming that we tried to pass a bipartisan border bill. What an absolute lie.
And if I can interrupt you real quick, Nick.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the biggest things, because in 2016, I didn't want to vote for Donald Trump because I didn't think he was going to be sufficiently conservative, and I was wrong about that. He governed conservatively, even though I don't believe he's a conservative in his heart. But Senator James Lankford was the guy that I was going to write in to be president of the United States, but you're not allowed to write in for president in the state of Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. But I was mortified at how easily played James Lankford was during that entire process, because he became the conservative ginger figurehead of, no, this is actually a good thing. Why are you so mean? Why don't you understand it? Have you read the bill? And it's like, well, you read the bill and then you ask the same questions because it's the same data. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
It was billions of dollars going to Ukraine, going to foreign aid, doing all this stuff packed into an immigration bill.
Yep.
And the question I asked Democrats that would bring this up, I was like, can you please tell me what new authorities or funding this administration needs to do the exact same thing the previous administration was doing with the current authorities and funding. You don't need anything extra. You don't need anything extra. You're pretending to, and then you're putting a poison pill in a bill so that when it gets voted down, you can say, oh my gosh, Republicans killed a bipartisan border security bill because they don't care about the issue. What an absolute lie. So the first thing, Trump needs to go in there, use the existing authorities and funding that he has in order to secure the border. And then Congress should actually be assisting with additional funding to be able to do more down there because a lot more is needed. That's one of the first things that he can do that he has authority on. Same thing with certain immigration policies as well. The second thing, and this is the one that's a little not quite as known by people, and it's what we call Schedule F. So most people have this idea that the president is in charge of the federal government, and that is technically true, but practically not. And the reason why is because we have something called civil service laws. Now, civil service laws were implemented at the federal level in order to prevent what we used to call the spoils system. So way back when the federal government was far smaller than it is today, people would run for president, and one of the way that they would bribe people to vote for them or bribe people to work for them is they would promise them jobs within the federal government because the president had broad sweeping authority on, who served in what position. Now, again, when the best you can do is like handing out positions in the postal service, that's not as big a deal.
Right. When
you now have a massive federal bureaucracy, which was never envisioned by the Constitution or the founders, that's a very different game. And so what the argument was is that, look, we don't need someone running for president being able to hand out tens of thousands of government jobs in order to bribe people to vote for them. And I think most of us would look at that and be like, oh, that makes some sense. Yeah. That makes some sense. And so what they said is that, okay, for like these low, mid-level, positions, we're going to call those civil service positions. And the president doesn't hire or fire those people. They go through an entirely different process. The result is that more and more people have fallen within that civil service category. And what we've discovered is the bureaucracies have agendas of their own. And those bureaucracies are not always there to, let's say, diligently fulfill the duties and responsibilities associated for why the organization was sold to the American people in the first place. They have their own ideological interests. They have their own professional interests. And so the typical bureaucracy always wants to expand authority and expand its budget. Always. Because that's the measure of, moving on to a next position is, oh, I manage this position and it had this many people and it had this much money that we spent. It's not really based off of what did you actually accomplish. It's based off of what did you control. And so there's this perverse incentive for bureaucracy to increase. Schedule F essentially was this designation within civil service, which we said, okay, these employees are just civil servants and they don't get impacted by who's president. But these people who set policy, they're the ones that can get hired and fired by the president because they're responsible for actually implementing this process. The problem is we found out that the bureaucracy actually has a tremendous amount of power to slow roll or subvert policy if they don't agree with it.
Yep.
And the left has made a concerted effort in conjunction with higher education and everything else to create a left-wing bureaucratic state. So regardless of who's president, regardless of who controls Congress, if the people responsible for implementing the policy don't want to, there's 1,000 ways that they can screw that up and never get fired.
Right.
So now the trick here is this. Schedule F can be very, very broadly interpreted. So if President Trump shows up on day one and says, guess what? 90% of the federal workforce is now Schedule F because you have some role in implementing or carrying out policy. You now work at will, at the pleasure of the president. Okay, well, now you can fire wide swaths of the bureaucracy without a single law having to be passed. And honestly, on some level, we need to recognize that while one of the underlying objects of the Constitution and the American political experiment is to prevent the centralization of power, there's also a problem with too much decentralization in certain areas. And by that, what I mean, because believe me, I'm a big decentralization of power guy. If you're going to put somebody in charge of something, they have to actually be in charge of it. You can't put them in charge of it, take away 80% of their authority, and then blame them when they can't get anything done if the thing that's holding them up is the 80% they don't control.
Right.
And so there needs to be reform in this. I think the president should broadly interpret Schedule F. I'm sure he'll end up in court. Fire him anyways. Fire the necessary bureaucrats anyways. Only keep the ones that are necessary in order to carry out the core functions. Whenever we hear non-essential government employees, that's a good place to start. And maybe people that don't need to be collecting a paycheck based off of the work and labor of taxpayers. So those are two things that I am really looking forward to see within the first 6 months of the presidency. The border, I want to say, like within the first 100 days, I think you're going to see a lot of emphasis on border and immigration policy. But like kind of that broader 6-month process and in conjunction with the DOJ doing their work and doing their findings, I think what you're going to see is, in fact, we're planning to do a whole separate show on just the DOJ for 2025 and 2026, where we go over what they should do, what they are doing, what they're analyzing, and then taking that information and then utilizing a broad interpretation of Schedule F to significantly diminish the size of these bureaucracies. Ultimately, when it comes to actually getting rid of certain departments, certain agencies, engaging in consolidation, that requires acts of Congress. Right. And the big hang up there is going to be in two places. One, that's going to be the Senate, with the filibuster being regularly utilized. The other thing is going to be with weak Republicans. You're going to have Republicans in areas where they're like, well, this is going to hurt me for my reelection, or, oh, I don't know how I'm going to say right now, I don't care that we have 2 years, not 4, 2, to make the sort of structural changes that are necessary in order to set us up for success going forward. And if you are not willing to sacrifice your seat to make those structural changes, you don't belong there. That's the bottom line. I understand not wanting to throw away a vote on a stupid bill that's not going to do anything that hurts you in your district. I get it. I get it. But when you have the opportunity to make important and necessary structural changes to once again re-embrace the true intention of the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8, as opposed to this massive expansion of federal government, you got the ability to do that and you don't because you're afraid of losing your election. You don't deserve to be there. Period. The end. I hope we're going to see that. The other thing too, from like pieces of legislation that I would love to see that I think are absolutely necessary and would be really, really important structural changes. One is one issue per bill. We have this in the Virginia Constitution. I'm not allowed to submit a bill in the Virginia General Assembly that is the Save the Puppies Act, which then gives a bunch of money somewhere else or changes regulations in a completely different area. If I got a Save the Puppies Act bill, that bill has to focus exclusively on saving the puppies, right? Congress doesn't have to do that. One issue per bill is something that should be implemented as policy. Another really important one is the REINS Act that Rand Paul has always carried. And the REINS Act does an excellent job of stripping power away from the bureaucracy to promulgate all of these regulations. Because this is another thing that most voters don't understand, is that your representative voted on a bill called the Clean Energy whatever, and it didn't lay out nearly as many specifics as you would think it did on how to implement that policy. Instead, what it generally does is they write these broadly based bills that give a massive amount of power to an executive branch agency to promulgate regulations, come up with fines, come up with fees. And now that executive branch agency has the ability to fundamentally destroy your business, rob you of your property rights. And guess how many people voted on those actual regulations? None. Zero. So Rand Paul has a really good bill called the REINS Act that would essentially say that anytime you're going to try to allow an executive branch agency to widely promulgate regulations, we're not talking about simple internal, mechanisms. We're saying regulations that have the force of law that are impacting businesses. You have to bring that back to the legislature, and then your representatives have to vote on it with the full knowledge of how it's going to be implemented. They don't get to vote on a nice sounding idea over here and then come back and say, oh gosh, we had no idea it would be interpreted that way, and then absolve themselves of responsibility. So one issue per bill, the REINS Act, those are two pieces of legislation that I would also like to see within the first year that I think would just be transformational.
Well, a few things I want to double click on. Number one, obviously, people need to be very realistic about what can be done. Yes. So that's number one. What can be done in a short period of time. Number two, yes, we don't have 4 years. We have 2. Some people are already looking past this administration, wondering if it's going to be Vance and Gabbard or, whatever the combination is going to be for 2028. But I want to go back to the border, because the border situation has caused major issues. Obviously, there's been a lot of time and effort spent on elucidating that topic. There's been no real discussion of militarizing the southern border. And so to someone who's not been in the military and doesn't understand what it would look like to put the National Guard or even the full-on military down there like that, that's one thing to say that. It's another thing to actually see that happening. But what we are seeing is at the beginning of this year, we've already seen 2 terrorist attacks in pretty close succession to one another. Now, these were both United States citizens, and so it's a little bit of a different situation. But we see from a lot of different people that know a thing or two is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of terrorists that are in sleeper cells in the United States currently. Are they planning an October attack like what happened in Israel? Are they planning off a very sophisticated, coordinated, everybody clacks off their vest at the same time type of attack? But this one's in a shopping mall, and this one's in a kid's school, and this one's in a concert venue or something like that. We don't really know, but a lot of it comes because we saw these people just walk right through the southern border, sometimes with the help of some of our other adversaries. And so we can't talk about the specifics of the 2 attacks that just happened because this is going to be released about a week after, and we're getting new reports every few hours. Yeah, but just talk about the southern border and not just the economics of having people in this country that are not paying taxes, that are suckling from the teat of the American system, versus just protecting the homeland in general from the inside.
Sure. Well, the first thing to understand too about immigration, so there's border security and immigration policy, and they're obviously connected, but they have unique components to each one that are separate. And look, I'm a good immigration policy, which allows people that genuinely want to come on and appreciate what America is and be a part of it, is a net advantage for the country. There's no question of that. It's not even, Elon Musk is an immigrant, right? Like it's not a question. But when you have a bad immigration policy that essentially encourages people to come to the United States, to take advantage of a massive welfare state, to do all of those things, that's problematic. But the security side is also significantly problematic, both from a criminal and a terrorist perspective. If you want to get into the United States, the easiest way to do it is to go somewhere south of the border and then come through our southern border. And so you got to ask yourself the question, are there terrorist organizations that want to do harm to the United States, or at the very least want to have the capacity to do harm to the United States, while subverting some of the other security measures that have made it more difficult to use what we might call more classical examples of terrorism? Yes, there is. That's not a question. That's not a question. Sean Ryan has had some great episodes where he's had guests talk about this in depth. So yes, that's absolutely the case. So how do you deal with that? Well, with people that are already here, that's going to be, obviously a law enforcement mechanism, because we have posse comitatus, which prevents the United States military from being deployed within the United States in order to fulfill a law enforcement role. Now, when it comes to securing the border, I think there's a lot more gray area here legally with respect to what can be done. I think you can use the military because I think you look at it as something of an invasion of U.S. soil. Yep. And so it's not that the United States military is fulfilling a law enforcement role. They are fulfilling a security role with respect to the integrity of our border. I think that falls very neatly within the responsibility of the Department of Defense. So I think it can be done. There does have to be, you do have to have careful jurisdiction on how it's done, because the only other time that the United States military can essentially be deployed in order to put things down, especially if you're talking about active duty, federal troops, not just National Guard, is the Insurrection Act, right? So when you have legitimate insurrections taking place within the United States border, you need to be very, very careful about utilizing the military for that purpose. So I definitely think we can use the military to help secure the border, to help plug gaps from the terrorism component. There's also the criminal component. And I think it's important to understand that when we talk about crime, yes, it's bad enough when we talk about fentanyl coming across the country, or when we talk about, other things that would be potentially dangerous or economically damaging. But it's especially insidious when we're talking about human trafficking for labor, human trafficking, sex trafficking, when we're talking about the amount of impact it has on children and how children are utilized to facilitate this process. One of the things I've tried to convince my colleagues of, and it almost always falls on deaf ears, is when they say things like, oh, but DACA, right? Oh, but unaccompanied minors. Oh, but it's like, wait a second. If you provide a legal incentive for unaccompanied minors to cross the border, cartels, terrorist organizations are going to exploit minors in order to facilitate the illicit transfer of not just people, but also drugs and other things. So please stop pretending that you are implementing a policy that is only going to achieve what you hope it does. You're creating an incentive structure that is very easily exploited by terrorist and criminal organizations. The cartels are I won't say that they're running Mexico, but they are a de facto shadow government in Mexico, to the point where the Mexican government is clearly incapable of keeping them under any element of control. To the point where they have the ability to significantly impact both the politics and the economy of that country. And so the question is going to be, is there any sort of military role with respect to degrade the cartel's capability? Now, a lot of people, and look, I love libertarian philosophy. Sometimes I get a little bit frustrated with libertarians, but I love libertarian philosophy. They will say, well, the solution to that is you just legalize drugs and that'll take care of it. I understand the underlying philosophical argument of let people do what they want with their own bodies, provided they're not hurting someone else. I don't think that's a realistic thing to do when you have a massive welfare state and you have a massive, criminal organization currently in place that you're dealing with. So I do believe that there's going to be an appropriate role for both military and law enforcement to actively operate in the degrading of cartels' capabilities. The problem is, though, to the libertarians' point, is that, okay, you cut the head off the snake, but you still got, a multi-billion-dollar, $1 trillion industry worldwide. Somebody else is going to be willing to take the risk in order to facilitate that. So how do you shut that down? So there's going to have to be a combination of both policy and force that's applied in order to secure the southern border, to protect against both terrorism and to protect against criminal activity. And again, I'm using criminal activity to isolate specifically that which we might associate with violent criminal activity, illicit drugs, things like that. It's also important to understand that crossing the border illegally is itself criminal activity.
Correct.
Right? I get so frustrated with this idea. Well, they haven't broken any laws except for the one they broke when they came over. Right? And when they broke that law and came over, and then had a child, and then enrolled their kids in public school, and then did those other things, they are now reaping the benefits of subsidization that they're not contributing to. And they'll always argue, it's like, oh, you don't think illegal aliens pay taxes, you're nuts. I understand they pay sales taxes. You can't avoid it. I understand that they're paying property taxes because when you rent from somebody, even if you do it illegally, that's getting passed on because the landlord essentially will pay property taxes. So I understand that they're not paying all their income taxes, they're not paying all federal income. That is not a thing. Not to mention the fact that there's no way that they're paying as much in taxes as that they're actually consuming with respect to public services. So let's just be common sense about this. Do I think we should deploy the military to round up everyone in the country that's here illegally and deport them? No, I do not. No, I do not. I don't think anybody wants the 82nd Airborne Division rolling through there. It's not an appropriate role for the United States military, and it's not the best way to do it. What I would love to see is increased military presence at the border in order to plug security gaps, increase law enforcement at the border in order to be able to handle a changing of the policy with respect to asylum seekers so that they can be in a safe location while they appeal for asylum, but they're not let into the interior of the United States. And then what I want to see is a policy which says this: if you are currently in the country illegally and you come forward and you self-report, we will review your case. I had a case where there was a woman, she was brought to this country when she was 2 years old. She's currently 27, married with 4 kids. Should we deport her? Probably not, right? Like I'm a reasonable person. I want border security. I want tougher immigration policy. I'm a reasonable person. No, I don't want to deport that woman who's married to an American citizen with 4 kids. Okay. But if you're here, like, well, I crossed the border because I wanted a better life for my family. Great. As a man, as a husband, as a father, I completely appreciate that incentive structure and you acting on that. Here's what's going to happen next. You're going to have to go back home and you're going to have to get back in line and you're going to have to follow the process. And if you do that, we'll forgive this. If you don't do that and we find you, so you get this grace period. If you don't do that and we find you, you will be deported with no chance to ever come back to the United States under any circumstances. And so I think that's the sort of, now you've created the appropriate incentive structure for people to say, gosh, I really want to be able to come back to the United States. Either I want to be a citizen or I want to do whatever else it is. And if I get picked up, that's it. It's done. I will never be allowed back because they've already secured the border. That's really important, right? You've got to secure the border. You got to shut off the flow. Then you implement the policy that provides the incentive structure for people to self-identify and deport. And then you can provide them a mechanism for coming back in when it makes sense for us as a country. Because as much as I sympathize with somebody that wants a better life for their family in the United States, I would just point out there was a lot of people that wanted a better life for their family in the United States. And you know what they did? They made their country better.
Yep.
So I don't think it's too much to ask that you go make your country better. Now, if you feel like you're in a position where that's completely impossible or you're being hunted by your government, I understand asylum seeking. And maybe it makes sense for you to seek asylum in the United States. Or maybe it makes sense for you to seek asylum in one of the 7 countries you pass through in order to get here.
Right.
So let's have a common sense approach to this. We can be compassionate, but my compassion as an elected official is first and foremost reserved for the American people. That's where my emphasis is supposed to be as an elected official. As a Christian, I can love and care about somebody and recognize that they're created in the image of God, regardless of where they're born or their circumstances. I can voluntarily spend my money or my time helping somebody in order to give them a better life. But I have no authorization to utilize my constituents' money in order to facilitate a policy that doesn't work in the best interest of my constituents. And that's where we need to focus in on. And again, structurally, we need to remove some of the perverse incentives that exist both within, our welfare state. Because here's another thing that we need to be honest about, right? The United States has a massive welfare state, and that itself operates as a draw for people to come to this country, right? I probably have more in common with some young father right now that is working themselves to the bone in New Delhi, that just wants an opportunity to be able to work without the government or without gangs or without everybody else, hurting them, hurting their kids, I got a lot more in common with that guy than I do with probably some sociology majors at Cal Berkeley that hate this country and want to see it turned into a socialist hellscape. So that's fine. But the bottom line is my obligation as an elected representative is to operate within the best interest of American citizens. So I don't think that's too much to ask.
Well, I don't think it's too much to ask. And also you use the word compassion earlier, which is a word that is used like a club, depending upon what someone's trying to get through. But there has to be some compassion, but there has to be logic. So for instance, let's say my dad laundered a bunch of money, right? So, or somehow, or no, he knocks off a liquor store and he steals a bunch of money and he shoots the guy on the way out. But then I don't know any of that. And he just hands me the money as a gift. Hey son, I got you an extra 10 grand for Christmas. Aren't I such a cool dad?
Yeah.
Well, whenever the police find out what all happened, they find out that the money was given to me. Do I just get to keep that money now? Because, I wasn't part of the crime. And so it's like, yes, there is compassion, but there is also the other side and the other line. Now, Nick, there's
one thing on that too. I want to, because the biggest problem here, it's not that those of us who want stronger immigration policy lack compassion, to your point. It's that it's where the compassion gets directed first. So for instance, I have compassion for children in foreign countries who are struggling. And I'm willing to donate my own time and money to assist with that. I have. But I don't have a greater obligation to them than I do my own children. If I were allowing my own children to starve or to go without in order to do that, I would be neglecting my responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that we have people right now that are carrying the mantle of compassion and altruism who are not being compassionate and altruistic. They're either being foolishly short-sighted or they have a hidden incentive that they're not actually telling you about because they believe that there's some sort of benefit that they yield, probably politically, perhaps economically, by exploiting this situation to their advantage. And now what they've done is, as you've said, they've used compassion as a bludgeon against people who are looking at that and going, whoa. You're not being compassionate. You're setting up bad policy with bad incentive structures that are going to yield bad results for our citizens. Right? So no, that doesn't make you compassionate. It either makes you devious or it makes you ignorant. If you're ignorant, educate yourself. If you're devious, correct.
Right. I always talk about it in two ways. It's like, in order for these Marxist or socialistic or communistic ideas to come, you need conscious nefarious actors, one, or you need You need idiots. You basically useful idiots. So you need those two types of people in order to get things done. So I want to put a pin in some of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of like politics and, all that type of stuff, because I think where a lot of this comes from is cultural issues that we're having. Specifically, I think this has been said a lot in a lot of different ways. Perhaps you've even said it on your show. Almost every single problem we have in this country or in the world is because of bad manhood, lacking manhood, no fathers, like fatherlessness as an epidemic, not just in this country, not just with certain racial cohorts, but literally all across the entire globe. And part of the reason I think we're in this position, Nick, because you've already talked about you're a man of faith, you're a follower of Christ, as am I, as are most of the listeners of this podcast. But masculinity and manhood inside of the church, right? So let's just call it the capital C church, is abysmal. Why does Undaunted.Life exist? Because I get pitched all the time to have these guys with these other men's ministries come on my show. And part of me is like, look, if you were better at what you were doing, I wouldn't have to do what I'm doing. Look, if you were better running your congregation and setting up a man-friendly church, I wouldn't have to scream so much about it from the bottom, trying to create a groundswell of people that are changing things. Because we've gotten this idea that Jesus was this wispy-haired Danish guy that never would have hurt a fly. And not that he actually left the temple when he saw something sinful happening. He went and made a whip of cords and came back. Now, that's not all he did, but it certainly was in the, options of what he could do. So just in general, I have some other questions, but just in general, give us your read of the state of manhood or masculinity inside of Jesus's church.
So I was speaking at Liberty University a while back, and I asked the crowd, we had about 1,000 people there. And I asked the crowd, I said, you know why nice guys finish last? So because they should.
Okay.
Jesus was not a nice guy. Jesus was not a nice guy. Jesus was honorable. He was loving. He was committed to justice. He was committed to compassion, repentance, restoration. But he was bold. He was intelligent. He was unapologetic for what he believed. And obviously, I believe that Jesus was not just, a man, but God.
Right.
But it's important to illustrate this because, as you pointed out, we've been fed this nice guy boy band version of Jesus, and a lot of men are looking at that going, especially men that don't fully understand or not yet. Let's say men that are not committed to Christ. Look at this as like I can look at that version and be like, that's not accurate. But if you've never been shown the actual Jesus, and that's all you've gotten, you should never be surprised why young men that want to be strong, that want to be competent, that want to be formidable, that want to be brave would look at that and be like, yeah, this sounds like a really nice hippie that got beat up and crucified for his troubles.
Yeah.
Not interested. And I understand why they wouldn't be interested in that heretical form of Jesus Christ. But then you actually look into who Jesus was and is. And the way that he responded to situations, and it's incredible. It's divine, both literally. But I tell people, like, if you can go back and you can kind of like for a moment, just engage in this part where you kind of separate in your mind, create this compartmentalization in your mind and take everything that you think you know about Jesus, especially if you have this image of him as this kind of like weak hippie version, socialist Jesus. Put that in a box for a second, open up a new box, go into the New Testament and start reading it again. And instead of just like kind of glazing over the words, I want you to think about the individual situations he was in. Think about the history of what's going on in the world at that particular time. Think about who are the actual political authorities, who are the military authorities. Think about the culture that he's engaging in. Think about the implications. Think about the risks that are being taken. Think about the sacrifice that's being made. Think about the discipline that's being demonstrated. Think about the intelligence that is being utilized and the way questions are asked and how they're responded to. And what you find is this incredibly, this incredible man, this incredible individual with this depth of intelligence and control over one's emotions and courage and strength and presence, and the ability to speak, as Ray Comfort would said, to speak mercy to the broken and judgment to the proud. in a way where it's like he had no political authority to do any of this stuff. It's not as if he had a bunch of guys. Yeah, he had the disciples, but it's not like he had a bunch of guys that were armed backing him up wherever he went. He was going in places where they knew they wanted to kill him. He was going anyways, and he was speaking the truth. And if it offended you, that was on you. It was the truth offending you, not his words. And he was willing to do it. And I'm looking at that as like, my gosh, that is someone I wish as much as I try to emulate that, I see all the areas where I fail, but I am so grateful for something to be able to emulate, something that is so complete and comprehensive that really demonstrates that my job as a man is not just to be physically capable, and not just to be intellectually competent, but also to have a sense of tenderness and compassion when it's called for. I mean, my gosh, this is the greatest story ever told. And I go into our churches and I see some like youth pastor in skinny jeans talking about Jesus Christ as if he's just a go along to get along, super tolerant, woke, progressive socialist. And I'm like, no wonder the church is in the state it is in. No wonder we are seeing like this massive heresy within the Protestant church specifically. And I'm a Protestant, but there's a split in every single one of these churches. And I look at every single one of these woke progressive churches, and I generally see somebody getting up there. Sometimes it's a man, sometimes it's a woman, and you see them claiming Jesus, but then preaching something that is absolutely heretical. But then I go into a church that's supposed to be doctrinally sound, and it's like they're afraid of it. They're afraid of what they believe. So what I would tell pastors, and what I would especially tell a lot of youth pastors, if you're a man and you're going to go into being a youth pastor, will you do me a favor? Would you actually be a formidable man? Would you be the sort of man that other young men can look up to? Would you be the other sort of man that young men can look up to and be like, my son-in-law does a lot of work he's a school counselor. Dude's 6'6". He's a big guy, right? And look, everyone will tell them his name is Nick too. Everyone will say Nick is the guy that they can go to. They can sit down. They can talk about talk about what they're struggling with. They can talk about problems. They can talk about concerns, and he will listen. He will diligently listen. He will offer good advice. He will pray for them. But he also doesn't give them excuses. And they're all pretty sure that Nick can kick their butt. So yes, that's what we want. We want young men who are trying to figure out what it means to be a man can look at other men who they see as being physically capable, intellectually competent, emotionally controlled, professionally successful, and spiritually sound in what they believe in the relationship with Christ. If you are not those things, then this is not the paycheck for you.
Well, and that goes back to why I even started Undaunted.Life, because Nick, I became a Christian as a 15-year-old. My parents were divorced. My dad wasn't living at the house. I still had a relationship with him, but he wasn't living there. And so here I am, 15 years old. And at the same time, I'm simultaneously trying to figure out what it means to be a man. Now I'm trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian. And the determination I came to is that, those just aren't the same thing. All the godly men are inside the church doing God stuff, like praying on you, touching you, and giving you a limp handshake and wearing khakis. And all the manly dudes that are fighting and shooting and doing all the cool manly stuff, they're outside the church. There's just no crossover. Yeah. And I had that thought process until I got into my 20s, was really reading the Gospels for myself and thinking to myself, goodness gracious, this Middle Eastern Jewish construction worker seems like a pretty rough dude. He didn't seem to be too terribly concerned about how people felt about the things that he was saying, especially because they were true. And it seems like, if you talk about Lamb of God, you have to talk about Lion of Judah. If you talk about grace, you have to talk about truth. And I feel like we've gotten the tender part of Jesus down, but we don't have the tough part of Jesus enough.
Wait, no, you are absolutely spot on. And the biggest problem with that is that if you discuss the tenderness without the justice, without the judgment, without the strength,
right,
then you get a heretical version of Jesus. It's not that, we just haven't. No. You are commanded to know and love your God with all of your mind, with all of your spirit, with all of your strength. And part of that is about understanding everything that he said and the context in which he did it and why he did it the way he did. And it's to reduce to make it all one thing and not the other is to miss the point. It is to misrepresent who Jesus is. And so, no, I think you're absolutely spot on that. And I do think what it's led to. Now, I will say this as well. Part of the reason why that's taken place is because if you look at a lot of the people that volunteer and work in the church, and I can be guilty of this as well, you see a lot of women that step up to be able to fulfill those roles. And you've also seen a feminist movement that has tried to put more women into roles within the church that, again, I think I don't think it's unbiblical for women to play leadership roles within society. You see that within scripture. But I think it's also important to understand that it's not to the diminishment of the man's role in society and the man's leadership roles within society and within the church. And so we need more men who are not just professing Jesus Christ, but to your point, similar situation. My dad was very much involved in my life. I have a great deal of respect for my dad. LAPD homicide detective, right? I always saw him as a man's man. He's a Christian. My mom's a Christian. Love my mom. Great deal of respect for her as well. But it was a similar situation. School years with my mom, summers with my dad. And I remember going to churches in the 90s thinking that this was what I sometimes called a very emotional faith. Because it was a lot of emphasis on compassion. Now, that's not to say that there weren't people in my life that presented a different view of it. But a lot of times I just didn't see them as being very manly men. And when I got into the military and I'm in the infantry and I'm airborne and then I'm going to SF and stuff like, I'm around other guys that they drink hard, they cuss a lot. They, some of them do other things they shouldn't be doing. Right. But I really credit I really credit three men in particular. One was my neighbor, Anthony Brown. One was a team leader of mine in SF, Ryan Nienaber. And another was a gentleman, I forgot his name because I went to a school with him. The 18, Fox course was the Special Forces Intelligence Sergeant course. And he was just very influential, got me really interested in Christian apologetics and whatnot. But I'll say this, the reason why all three of those men were relevant to me and had influence on me was first and foremost because I respected them as men. They were guys that I saw that had a good presence when it came to fulfilling their responsibilities as husbands or fathers, or fulfilling the responsibilities of being soldiers. They were the sort of people that I knew I could count on in a fight. That was important. I could count on them in a fight.
Yep.
I could count on them to step up and do dangerous things if they needed to in order to protect others. So I admired all of those attributes, which are, by the way, godly attributes.
Right. Well,
I admire those attributes, and so I was willing to listen to them on the spiritual.
Right. Well, let me
actually coming from a guy that already had a foundation on it. So how much more important is it for somebody that has no foundation on it? How much more important it is for a young man to have no foundation on it? Because here's the other thing. I know we're talking about masculinity now, but if you really want true godly femininity to be able to flourish, it has to be protected by godly masculinity. And so for a lot of young men right now, they're saying, yeah, I do all that, but I got no hope of a family. I got no hope of a wife. I got no hope of that. If you want to foster the sort of femininity that you would like to see within society, start being a godly man and you will be shocked at how it contributes to the thing that you want.
Well, and I think one of the downstream things we're talking about is this overall idea that Christian men should be dangerous. So Jordan Peterson talks about this as well, not necessarily in a Christian context, but he talks about men who find virtue in being harmless.
Yeah.
And so they're so nice and they're so polite and they wouldn't hurt a fly. And they are saying, I am virtuous because of those things. But Jordan Peterson rightly points out, he's like, no, you're not virtuous. You're worthless, actually, because every single moral thing is, or we can take it this way. Every single threat is at the other end of a gun. So if a police officer says, sir, can you please step out of your vehicle? And you say no, that could eventually escalate to where you are actually fighting now, whether you're using the weapons that are on you or you're using these two, right? And so I talk to so many Christian men, and the number of Christian men that have started taking the idea of learning how to fight and learning how to be dangerous and getting concealed carry permits in states that require it and learning jujitsu and Muay Thai and boxing and all those things. We've had tons of guys do that because of our show. However, Nick, I still constantly run into men that think, why do I need to do that? I've got a phone that has 911 on it. Yeah. I can take care of that. And I do everything I can, Nick, to say, look, if help is minutes away, but the threat is already in the room, that's a major problem. Or these people that are like, well, I can still carry. Why would I ever need to know how to fight? These are always fat guys. But then it's like, okay, well, now you're in a fight at the airport, or now you're traveling and you don't have any of your weaponry with you. Now what? You're in a place where you have to use your body to protect an image bearer of Christ, and that image bearer could actually be you, and you're not prepared to do that. Certainly not physically, but some guys, Nick, are prepared physically, but not mentally. Yeah. They know how to fight, but if a fight breaks out, they immediately cower because they haven't pre-decided that I'm going to jump into the fray without regard for myself and my safety in order to protect another image bearer. So I think that's another problem in the church as well, is we don't encourage that. No,
I got a book that's actually coming out later this year. In fact, I don't think I've talked about this before. I might be introducing this on the
Let's go.
show. So I got a book that's coming out next year, and one of the chapters is know what you're willing to die for. Because that's something you decide long before. That's something you should decide long before you actually have to be in that situation.
Right.
Because there's not just the capability for violence, there has to be the capacity for it, in the sense that you are mentally prepared and wise enough to know when to utilize force and when not to utilize force. I don't believe in this idea of just utilizing force because, somebody just insulted you. It may be appropriate in certain circumstances, right? I'm not saying to be a punching bag for anybody or to be walked over by anybody. But you got a situation where maybe some kid is being drunk and stupid and yelling at you or screaming at you. That situation might be there to just, leave, or if you have somebody with you, you can get them out of the area or whatnot. It may be to intervene, depending on whether or not that person poses a threat to somebody else. So this is not a pride thing. And that's important to understand. This is not about protecting one's pride. It's about having the mental and physical capability and capacity to properly assess situations in order to do the honorable thing which is necessitated by that situation. Maybe it's protecting yourself. Maybe it's protecting others. Maybe it's protecting your family. There was a meme that was going around for a while. And I think it illustrates your point when somebody says, why do I need this when I can pick up the phone and dial 911? And it was a picture of this guy, obviously very, very physically fit, and another guy in front of him who obviously was not. And they're walking through what is obviously like it looks like a flooded street area. And the physically fit guy is holding a woman. And the meme says, why do I work out? And it's like, so I will never be that man. And he goes, yes, that's his wife. The big physically fit guy is carrying the other guy's wife for him.
Yep.
Through a flooded area. I want that image to burn in to the minds of a man to think, I'm not expecting you to be, we're both friends with Chad Robichaud, right? Chad Robichaud, professional MMA fighter for a part of his life, right? So I'm not expecting every man to be a professional UFC fighter or an MMA. I'm not expecting that. I'm not expecting everyone to be, a tier 1 operator within I'm not expecting that. But are you really telling me that it is okay in your mind that if there was a situation for which help was not available, you couldn't do it? Are you really going to tell me that you want a situation where if your family's in danger, you have to rely on another man in order to save your family? I'm not saying don't call the cops. By all means, you should be mentally in tune to say, there's danger here. I'm going to call the cops, but I'm also going to grab my sidearm and I'm also going to protect my family because I'm not at their mercy. I'm calling backup. I'm not calling someone to save me.
Yep.
Right. But I will never be like, insofar as within my power, right? Obviously, if somebody is, they're disabled or whatnot, they can't do that. That doesn't diminish them as a man. But if you have the physical capability to be able to do that and you are refusing to do so because you can pick up a phone, you should be ashamed of yourself. You should be ashamed of yourself. And then you should utilize that very appropriate shame you feel to go get to the gym or to go get yourself in physical condition to where you can do the things that ensure to your family that they can rely upon you. I said this once. I was talking to Matt Fradd and I said, one time my wife, something happened and I thought it was fairly minor. Right? Like we're at dinner and my youngest daughter at the time started like choking on a mozzarella stick or something like that. And I'm sitting here talking to someone and she goes, Nick. And I look over and I grab her and I do the Heimlich real quick. She spits it out. I'm like, you okay, sweetheart? Like, you okay, sweet pea? Yeah, I'm okay. Okay. All right. You good? Sure. Okay. And I go with my conversation. And we're driving home and we get home and I remember, man, it chokes me up to think about this. It's crazy. And she goes, you make me feel safe. I tell people, dude, I could go a year on that compliment.
That's it.
I could go a year on that compliment. So ask yourself this question. Do you truly make your family feel safe? If the answer is no, you owe them that. Yep. You owe them that. And so start doing the things that are going to put you in a position so where they can look at you and honestly say, you make me feel safe. Because I am telling you, there's something specific about that compliment. That will just, not only will it give you this tremendous sense of accomplishment, but it will also give you a tremendous amount of motivation to continue to develop the necessary skill sets to not only make them feel safe, but to make them feel secure, to make them feel loved, to make them feel heard, to do all of the other things that you want to be able to do as a husband, as a father, as a friend. And so I'll just leave it at that. It was a point in my life that here we are several years later that I can point back to, and I can tell you exactly the situation, how it made me feel, how she said it, like all of it. So all I can promise you is that all of the work you put into doing those things is tremendously worth it, and a part of your duty and responsibility as a man, and specifically as a godly man, if that's what you want to be.
Duty and responsibility for sure. And I want to coalesce all that into one final question, because I train really, really hard, Nick. I lift hard. I train jujitsu hard. Like everything I do in order to be a physical protector for my family, I train really, really hard to do that. And every now and then I'll get somebody, typically a fatty, will pull me aside and be like, hey man, why are you doing that? Hey, the Bible says being physically fit is of some value, right? I was like, well, yeah, you're putting emphasis on the some. I don't think the writer of that particular line did, but go ahead. But their thing is like, well, what exactly are you training for? And, one of my answers that I've given to that, which I stand by, is, well, I want to be physically ready regardless of what the situation requires. So if Nick says, hey, I lost my leg, it's gone, but there's a 5K that needs to be ran tomorrow to help support this military family. Can you go run it for me? Well, yeah, I don't need to train for that. I'm just going to go do it. Or, oh, there's somebody that's in trouble on a mountainside and, I'm going to ditch my pack and I'm going to grab 2 bottles of water and I'm going to be the one that can run down the mountain fastest to get that person help. Great. All that. But I have a 4-year-old son and a 2-year-old son. And James and Eli, if they're ever in a verbal confrontation with somebody on the playground and they say, my dad can beat up your dad, it is my responsibility to make sure that they're not lying. So that is why I train so hard, is so that I can cash a check that one of my sons writes if need be. Okay. So I want to basically put that all up into this last final question, because, and this is related to everything we're talking about, Nick. Raising strong sons, raising strong daughters, and also rites of passage for both. That requires a lot of a man. But if you don't do that, something or someone else will. That something is probably a left-wing atheistic society, which will tell them, here are the values we think should be inculcated into young men, and here are the values we think should be inculcated into young women. And then you have the problem, which I just saw this yesterday, haven't had a chance to vet it, so I might be speaking out of my butt, but roughly 10% of Gen Z girls are on OnlyFans performing, right? And roughly 50% of Gen Z boys, I say boys, men, are using OnlyFans. And so you're allowing something else to inculcate these values into your children. You're allowing society to catechize them as opposed to you and the scripture. So how are we as men, as fathers, as godly fathers, how are we to approach our fathers and our sons and our daughters in a way that would not only be honoring to God, but is setting them up for future success and health?
I mean, I think if you want to train your children in the way that they should go, right, which is biblically mandated, then you have to first look at whether or not you are actually somebody that they should reasonably be able to look up to demonstrate how to do that. So I think the first thing is to remember that it's important that we say the right things, but it's also important that we do the right things. Now, sometimes you may fall short of that. And one of the most important things I think a parent can do, and I as a father can do for my kids, is when I fall short and they see it or they point it out. I had one instance where I did not react to a situation well, and my daughter very respectfully said, hey, Dad, can I talk to you about this? And I had to look at her and say, you know what? You're right. I'm wrong. I apologize, and I appreciate you having the courage to come to me with this. And the reason why I think that's so important, we've been talking a lot about the physical, and that's an important component of that. I'll get to that in a second. But the reason why that is so important is because if you are seeking godliness, if you're seeking righteousness, that means there's an objective standard for right and wrong. And the author of that objective standard is God. It's not you. Mm-hmm. It's not you as the authority figure. And one of the biggest problems that we have, I think, within society in general, but specifically also within the Christian church, is that if you as a parent are telling your kids that something is right or wrong, and then you're engaging in it, and they catch you in it, either way, but if they catch you in it and you say, this is my house, I make the rules, I'm your father, I'm your mother, don't talk back to me, whatever it is, what you've just taught them is that, no, it's not an objective standard. It's just about authority. It's arbitrary. Whoever's in charge gets to make the rules. And you may think that works out fine, and maybe it does work out fine temporarily for when you're the primary authority figure for your children. What happens when you're not? What happens when it is the college professor? What happens when it is the abusive boyfriend? What happens when it is, somebody else, a boss, a friend group, whatever it is that is now leading them astray? And you say, I didn't raise you that way. Yes, you did. You taught them that right and wrong were completely arbitrary based off of who the authority figure was.
Yep.
They have to believe that it's truly right and wrong. And if it is, then it applies to you too. And so reinforcing in your children that the truth is not only objectively the truth, but deserves to be advocated for, deserves to be fought for. You might be the first authority figure that they have to stand up to on something when you've fallen a little bit short. Now, they should do it respectfully because you are their parent.
Right.
But when they do, thanking them for it and encouraging for it sets the right mindset, because whether it's your son, whether it's your daughter, all of them need to be able to one day stand up for what they believe in at great personal cost. So the first thing that you're actually developing in them is a mindset. It's a worldview built upon Christ, their relationship with Christ, and a firm commitment to biblical truth when it comes to things like right and wrong, and the way that you're supposed to interact with other people, the way that you're supposed to deal with certain situations. You're supposed to teach them the critical thinking so they can properly analyze things as they're taking place. You're supposed to teach them how to negotiate difficult situations, whether they be emotionally difficult or physically difficult or professionally difficult, and setting up that first standard of right and wrong. And so much of that is rooted in that first part, that foundation in Christ. If they have their identity in Christ, you're going to find a lot easier to teach them to do all the other things that they need to do. If they find their identity in being strong or being smart or being kind or being whatever else it is, at some point that's going to fail them. So you have to teach them to find their identity in Christ, to make their faith their own, to teach them the requisite skills. So that's the spiritual component. It's the intellectual component of engaging in conversation with them and letting them work through problems. It's the emotional component where you're actually teaching them to regulate emotions, not to ignore emotions. But emotions are an invitation to thought. So when they have an emotion about something, why? Discuss that. Teach them how to regulate it and utilize it the way God would have them utilize that emotion. Have them use that emotion as a key to be like, I need to change what I'm doing here, or that's not right and something's off about it, and now I'm going to think about why it's wrong and I'm going to avoid that, or whatever it is. But tapping into the emotion. It's about the physical. It's about being strong. It's about realizing that your body is a temple of God and that you should develop it to be able to provide for physical safety, to be able to provide the ability to do things that might need to be done in a dangerous situation, to be able, this is something too that I look at, like my wife and I made a commitment to each other. We're it. Like I'm the only guy she gets. She's the only woman I get. I'm happy about that decision. I want her to be happy about her decision. in all aspects of our marriage to include the physical. So that developing that physical component as well. And then finally the professional too is equipping your children with the idea and the understanding that the way that you provide for your family is by doing a good job of providing for others, providing the goods and services that other people want so that you can help them, you can enrich them, and you can also provide for your own family. And developing competency and skill sets, which can be used to both take care of your family and to also be able to engage in charity. So those are the 5 areas: the spiritual, the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the professional. As you are developing, and that's a constant development process. There's never a point where you're done. You are constantly developing those skills along that framework of Christ, that framework of scriptural, biblical truth. You're living that out as best you can. You're admitting when you're actually wrong. But I can't say this. I can't emphasize this point enough. The greatest testimony that you're going to have for anybody, and especially your children, is the way that you live your life. Now, you need to articulating it is great, but they want to see what you're doing. They want to see that you believe it so much that you actually develop not only the motivation, but the discipline to do the things that you need to do, to regiment the things that you do in order to be constantly working toward those processes. And they are picking up on cues from you on everything. They're picking up on cues in your marriage that is building the expectation for them on what they should expect within their own relationships. Right? So I know that's kind of again, all over the place answer, but if I could go back to the most important thing you're going to do is help your kids to realize that their identity first comes through Christ. And the way you have to start that process is by making sure that your identity first comes through Christ. And then you develop all of those other skill sets, not because that makes you who you are, but because you recognize that you are serving a greater purpose, and developing those skill sets allows you to better affect that purpose. And if you can do that as an individual, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, as a member of your community, you are going to be giving them an example that they will not only want to follow, but also build upon, right? I desperately want my kids to be better than me. But that means I have to provide something to aspire to and then to build upon. And the good news is while it's intimidating at times, and while it's frustrating at times when you fail, it is an incredible source of purpose and motivation. And it's incredible gift and responsibility that God gives us, especially as we become parents. So that's probably the best answer I can give without another hour.
Well, hey, Nick, I think you're making the fine point, which is you don't want to be the dad that's constantly saying, do as I say, not as I do. Like, you maybe get one of those. You maybe get one of those as you're raising a kid, and that's like, all right, I'm just going to go ahead and go with this. But if you're not modeling it, I don't know what you're doing, because with a lot of kids, it's caught, not taught in a lot of ways. But Nick, I had a feeling it was going to go this way, but you and I weaved in and out of a bunch of different subjects, and I feel like we could have gone a full 3 hours, but you got things to do. I got places to be as well. So that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity. Again, and I appreciate what you're doing. I think it's desperately needed in a culture that's increasingly tell us that masculinity is toxic. We need to recognize two things. Part of the reason why they've gotten rid of that narrative is not because masculinity is toxic, but because there are certain attributes associated with masculinity that can be used in toxic ways. And the solution to that, as you pointed out earlier, is not to be weak. It's not to be passive. It's not to be timid. It's not to be harmless. The purpose, and I think our biblical purpose, is to be men of honor, integrity. And in order to really do that where it counts, you need to be a man of capability, and you need to be a man of conviction. And where you place that convictions and where you get your identity matters. And when you get it in Christ, you're going to fall short. But you're always going to have something that's worthy to aspire to. And the more you aspire to it, the better off you will be in the process. And the more the people that you love and care about will benefit from that. So
amen and amen. Thanks, Nick.
All right. Take care, brother.
There you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed my time with Nick. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted.Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. So I've got 2 links for you today. I've got a link to Nick's website. So if you want to go and check out some of his merch, specifically all of his different coffee mugs, you can go there. And also you can check out his YouTube channel. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.